here are some notes on the philosophy of Eigenhoff. His work will not make much sense to you, I think, until you see why he claims that consciousness is presence or being, right? You want to see, whether you agree, whether you are convinced, you want to understand why someone would talk about the unseen problem of the physical. So what is the presence of the present? You might say that in some sense, consciousness is the present of what we call the physical. So you could say, the physical is made out of consciousness, but that's not quite right, because consciousness is not as stuff. But the things that we call physical, their manifestation, their there-ness itself is what we tend to call consciousness, the there-ness or presence of the world, but from a point of view. So if you look at Mach's book, The Analysis of Sensations, you see this brilliant, it's like he looks at the single phenomenal stream, and he kind of sees that the boundary between the so-called internal and the so-called external is fictional, conventional, practical. What you really just have is a stream of what he calls elements, which you would categorize as relatively internal or relatively external. So Ernst Mach, he kind of understood the phenomenal stream to be neutral. Okay, so Eigenhoff said he happened to be studying this book by Mach when it all clicked, when he finally got phenomenalism, but he had also read James. But once it clicked, right, once you understand what the phenomenalists were trying to say, then you read more deeply into that tradition. And then you see that, okay, if you understand a single phenomenal stream to be neutral or radically plural, how do you account for a world with many so-called conscious people? So how do the phenomenal streams relate to one another? So then you get into J.S. Mill, the idea of so-called empirical or physical objects as interpersonal possibilities of perceptual presence. You get Leibniz, who was kind of a perspectivist. William James was pretty great on this stuff. Schrodinger's view is kind of like an intensification of Leibniz's view. So once you're turned on to this possibility, to this alternative to indirect dualism, you find out that it's been there on the margins of the tradition the whole time. And I would say that Eigenhoff's work, more than being presenting itself as being especially creative, it's an attempt to recover and call attention to great philosophy that's being neglected. Right? So you can imagine a thinker who feels like he's found some old thinkers that are being ignored, even though they actually, in some sense, solve some of the problems that people wring their hands over, like the hard problem of consciousness. So for Eigenhoff, and not only him, the hard problem of consciousness sort of emerges from people not even seeing the hard problem of the physical. Or you could say that if you just start with indirect dualism, you've kind of started in a dead end. So you've set up a situation where you have a kind of hard problem, right? So it's kind of like a proof by contradiction, except people don't realize that they've assumed something absurd. And so physicality, what physical objects really are, that's left vague and unexamined. That would be the hard problem of the physical. There's this, sort of phony, tacit, third-person point of view or view from nowhere or God's eye point of view that people vaguely adopt without really coming to terms with it. They pretend that they're the omniscient narrator. And this is connected to correspondence theory of truth, as if they pretend they're the omniscient narrator who's not just another believer stuck with situated belief. But if you see that consciousness, the word consciousness, is a confusing synonym for presence or being, and this comes in two types of presence, perceptual as well as signative. But if you understand consciousness as presence, then you can also see that first-personness is primary rather than epiphenomenal. In other words, perspective is fundamental. So this from a point of viewness is very deep for Eigenhoff, as in it goes all the way down. Reality, the world itself, is fragmented or cracked. Reality is the logically fused system of its first-person streamings. So it's like a system of all of our existences, right? But these existences are tied together logically. So we share a world by sharing a language together. Or as Eigenhoff would say, if there is philosophy, then the world is a logically fused system of its first-person streamings. So given that this fragmentedness, this perspectivity goes all the way down, objects in this world are also fragmented. Every object is kind of like, it's almost like you take a glass Coke bottle, throw it on the ground, you have a bunch of shards. And each of these shards would be a perception of the object, if you want to talk in those terms, or a manifestation or face of the object. It all depends if you want to do a more subjectivistic language or a more object-favoring language. The key point here is that objects, ontology is kind of about objects in general and being in general, so we could say that all objects, and objects would be any kind of speakable unities, logical intentional objects, they have a from a point of viewness and a between us-ness. This is a weird Heideggerian lingo, hyphenation, and the point is to take a detour around more familiar technical terms that come with unwanted connotations, right? So with indirect realism, representationalism, the from a point of viewness is understood in terms of a kind of image in consciousness that is not the object itself. But we're trying to go around indirect realism. So every entity is a logical synthesis of its moments, right? So if we have that shattered Coke bottle on the ground with a bunch of shards, so the object is just the kind of ideal synthesis of all of those shards. Now, we don't know how many shards there are, right? We have an enduring possibility of perceptual presence that's open to future discussion and future perception. So you have a potential infinity of shards that are ideally synthesized or unified by what you might call the concept of the object. So, these moments of the empirical object, that's another word for shards, are its pieces. For instance, a single perception of a red rose would be a moment or aspect or face or shard of that rose. So maybe you look out a car window and you see this shining red rose. So part of that rose's real being would be in that passing manifestation or effigy of that red rose. And from a point of viewness is implicit in the way the rose manifests, right? Maybe the rose is just a small part of what you would call the visual field, or maybe you got your nose on the rose and your visual field is crowded with a rose so close that it's a little bit blurry. And of course, this is not all visual. We're visual creatures, so visual metaphors like aspect can be helpful, but this is all kinds of perceptual access, including that of rodents and aliens, especially anyone who can participate in the forum, in the conversation, but we can also project. We can project cognition on animals that can't speak for themselves. So that from a point of viewness, it's kind of implicit in the manifestation. So if I'm looking at a coin and I'm not using a mirror or a camera, I see one side of the coin or the other. So which side appears, you could say that implies a perspective. And maybe it is seen by candlelight, maybe the rose is seen by a colorblind person or by an alien with 17 eyes, right? So the manifestation of the rose will sort of imply the from a point of viewness, or the from a point of viewness is sort of there in the manifestation. But here's the other part. The rose in a full perception, a recognized rose, is also speakable or intendable or conceptualized or recognized. It is that rose over there. As Husserl emphasized, the rose is understood or taken to be transcendent in the sense that the rose is not inside of me, it's beyond me, and that it is also for others. And even my logical grip on the rose, the language that I grip the rose with, is sort of intrinsically social and transcendent. And if I walk around the rose, I see it from different positions. The manifestation is constantly changing, but I understand all of those manifestations or shards or faces to be faces of the same enduring rose, which is therefore an infinite system of adumbrations. And of course, I expect that others can walk up and see it. Maybe my friend is colorblind, maybe I've made friends with an alien with 17 eyes, and I'll have to talk with him about how that rose appears. And importantly, even if the rose is destroyed, thrown on a fire, on a bonfire, I can continue to refer to it. I can discuss it with others. So the essence of the rose is not really its empirical predicate. Its perceptual manifestation, you might say, is organized by the signative presence that I can carry away from it, and then I can remember a destroyed rose. I can hope for a rose that is not yet manifested. And this is one of the reasons that empirical existence is a predicate. And I would agree with Eigenhoff and Meinong that the fundamental kind of being is this kind of signative presence, the discussability or the presence to logic.